San Luis is the oldest non-Indian community in Colorado.
A Hispanic culture in an American society.
It's a place where the spirit of who we are, the spirit of religion, the spirit of family is important.
It's that uniqueness, it's that friendliness, it's that openness. It's a very spiritual place.
This part of the United States was actually settled long before Plymouth Rock was settled, long before the Pilgrims entertained a community on the eastern side of the country.
We want to show our children and our children's children what life was at the beginning here in San Luis.
This place is special.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library and History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
If you looked at a map of southern Colorado, it's pretty easy to find the San Luis Valley. It's an arrowhead-shaped valley in the dead center of southern Colorado, between the Sangre de Cristo Range on the east and the San Juan Mountains on the west, reaching down into New Mexico and ending in a point to the north at the watershed of the Arkansas River.
It's the highest alpine valley in the continental United States. It's also the largest alpine valley. We are 150 miles long and 50 miles wide.
The valley in size is equal to about the country of Israel, bigger than some of the states like Rhode Island or Connecticut.
The San Luis Valley was the home of the Ute Indian tribe. For centuries, if not millennia, Ute Indian people have used the valley as a place to live, a place to find game, to hunt, to fish, to gather resources that they need in order to survive in the Rocky Mountains.
They were nomadic people who lived off the land, so they were eating whatever they could hunt and whatever they could gather, buffalo and deer and rabbits and whatever berries and fruits that were in the area at the time.
The oldest evidence of human habitation goes back more than 11,000 years.
Folsom Points were discovered by the Great San Luis National Park. It is considered sacred ground for the Native American. Mount Blanca is one of the 4 sacred mountains for the Navajo.
The Hopi, their creation where they came up out of the middle of the earth was near what we know as the San Luis Lakes. So the valley has always been an area where people came to hunt, mostly. It was well known for antelope, deer, elk, buffalo. The winters were always too harsh for anybody during those times to stay for very long.
The first people that came through were the Spanish. Francisco de Coronado and his band of soldiers got here on or about August the 25th, 1542. That's the feast of St. Louis, the King of France. And that's where the name comes from, San Luis Rey de Francia. And the valley took its name from there. And so after that, the place was known as El Valle de San Luis, even though there was no people here.
It was actually first Spain when people started coming into the valley and exploring it. There were many explorations into the valley, but none that really were able to sustain themselves until the 1830s, 1840s.
Most of the people from here can trace their ancestry to those early Spanish explorers and settlers.
By the 1820s and 30s, sheep herders from northern New Mexico were grazing their flocks in the southern reaches of the valley. And by the 1830s, Hispanic settlers began to try to establish the first permanent settlements in the valley. Now, those early attempts were thwarted by the Ute Indians, who still called this their home. And the Utes, although very tolerant of Spanish and Mexican traders and travelers, simply weren't ready to accept Hispanic settlement in the valley.
There was a treaty between the Ute and the Spanish settlers. The Ute were then in a reservation in southwestern Colorado. So that left the San Luis Valley here for settlement.
Many communities were set up along the riverbanks because it provided access to water for irrigation, water for sustenance, water for your animals. So those areas were settled first. People were working the land, trying to create crops, trying to create some sense of sustainability, growing their own food, gardens. They brought with them the churro sheep and cattle and horses, so they were able to create ways to feed their families and then ways to barter with each other. There was really no form of currency, but people were using what they created to help sustain each other.
In 1821, the Republic of Mexico won its independence from Spain, and the valley became part of Mexico. After the Mexican-American War of 1848, the valley became part of the United States as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So at different times, you could have lived in the valley and at least been under the paper jurisdiction of the Empire of Spain, the Mexican Republic, and the United States of America.
The Spanish government and the Mexican government both gave land grants to large groups of immigrants who were moving from northern New Mexico into southern Colorado. The Bobin land grant, the Sangre de Cristo land grant, and the Conejos land grant were 3 land grants that all had something to do with property in the San Luis Valley.
In 1844, the governor of New Mexico, a man named Manuel Armijo, issued a land grant in the San Luis Valley to 2 residents of Taos, New Mexico, a man named Narciso Beaubien and another Canadian immigrant named Stephen Louis Lee. Lee and Beaubien were killed in the Taos Pueblo uprising of 1847, and their claims went to Narciso's father, Carlos Beaubien. Carlos Beaubien was a judge, he was a businessman, he was very well connected in New Mexico society. And by the early 1850s, after the valley became part of the United States, Beaubien began sponsoring settlers and colonists to move on to his land grant in the San Luis Valley.
San Luis was established on April 5th of 1851, and that's why it is referred to as the oldest town in the state of Colorado.
And so under Beaubien's sponsorship, the first group of farmers and settlers arrived in San Luis, and they established a placida, an enclosed village community, and worked with Beaubien to create a set of rules about communal ownership of nearby land.
There were 2 pieces of public land that were part of the Sangre de Cristo land grant. One was the Vega, and the other one was the Sierra.
Under the control of Carlos Beaubien, the settlers of San Luis arranged for the use of 900 acres of common pasture land where everybody could graze their cattle or sheep. It was known as La Vega. And La Vega in San Luis still exists today. It's still the largest common in America today. The only other extant common is the Boston Common in Boston, Massachusetts, which is only a couple of acres. La Vega is 900 acres of community land that everybody can use for grazing their livestock.
And then the other piece of the public land was the Sierra, which is the mountain, and that was to be used for hunting and for cutting wood.
And they enjoyed those rights without interruption through a succession of different landowners.
Somebody sold it and didn't bother to tell the people that it had been sold, and by the time people figured it out, the man named Jack Taylor owned it, and he put up a fence and didn't want to let people on it.
Effectively separating them from their communal usage rights. The fight over who had access and who had rights to use resources on Culebra Peak began to wend its way through the courts in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s. For more than 40 years, residents of San Luis fought to restore their traditional communal rights. Finally, in 2002, the Colorado Supreme Court decreed that the residents of San Luis still should enjoy their communal use rights to the mountain tract.
And so now people who own land on the land grant, you're given a key to get access to the ranch. So it's still privately owned, but can be accessed by people who live on the land grant.
The Taylor family no longer owns it, but the owners today are working with the San Luis community to make sure that all of their rights that were guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, rights that were enshrined in the deed that Carlos Beaubien gave to the residents of San Luis, that those rights are being honored today.
We all have keys to get in, but one of these days the locks will be changed and none of us will have access.
San Luis is the oldest non-Indian community in Colorado, dating to 1851. And by 1852, the settlers in San Luis began digging their first irrigation works to divert water out of the Culebra River and into the Vega. They filed a claim on that ditch in 1852, which makes it the priority water right in Colorado.
There's a main head gate that brings the water in from the Culebra River into the ditch. As the water flows down the ditch, the first properties then have their own head gate. They block off the water, and the water then goes onto their field.
So acequias are the way that we irrigate our crops. It's a flood irrigation.
And so those ribs of ditches make sure that all the land is flooded.
The Moorish influence in our communities was the acequias, making sure that the land had access to water and the water had access to land so you could grow a crop. And doing that in such a way that gravity provided a majority of the work, so that the bodies weren't being used to move the water, it was actually the water moving itself.
Once their shares are used, then they close their gate, release the water to go down the ditch. The next person opens their head gate, and they irrigate their land.
Colorado's water law is entirely based on the idea of first in time, first in right, which means the oldest continual users have the priority water rights. The People's Ditch is the oldest priority water right. So if water dries up everywhere else in Colorado, the users of the People's Ditch get their water first.
So even Colorado water law reflects Mexican law, reflects Spanish law, reflects Arabic law when it comes to the use of water.
The Spanish word for the People's Ditch is la acequia madre, the mother ditch. You think of these ditches as arteries where the lifeblood of a community, the water, flows in order to keep the community vibrant and alive and thriving.
Without water, there's no life. There's life for plants. Animals then sustain life from the plants. As humans, we sustain life through plants that we raise crops, or animals that we raise domestically, or that people hunt.
And so you begin to see this sort of growing natural landscape along the ditch lines that flow through these communities. So not only do they hold the communities together, but they're threads of nature that run along the courses of the village.
Without water, none of those would be possible. So people use the plants for medicine, for food, in order to maintain life. And all of that's possible through the water.
Imagine what it's like if you're a settler in San Luis in 1852. You're in this land that's claimed by the United States, but this is land that is really controlled by the Utes, and there's a lot of tension, a lot of friction. Towns like San Luis were built in enclosed squares to provide protection and fortification in the case of Indian raids, and certainly that was needed. The Utes were still contesting the Spanish settlers' right to live in the valley. But by 1852, the United States government intervened by building a military post called Fort Massachusetts in the northern portion of the valley along the flanks of Mount Blanca.
Fort Massachusetts was in existence for 6 years, and originally it was thought to be an ideal location where they could look out over the valley and see if there were any marauding native tribes. But it turned out to be an isolated spot. And so in 1858, Fort Garland was established.
I think it gave a sense of safety, a sense of access to the larger region on those trade routes, and a little bit of sense of protection.
But in fact, it was also there to keep an eye on the Hispanos themselves, because in 1852, the United States was only 4 years away from the War of Conquest, where the United States had acquired southern Colorado and the rest of the American Southwest from Mexico. Those Hispanos who lived in the valley in the 1850s, many of them had fought on the side of Mexico in their war against the United States aggression. So Fort Massachusetts and its successor Fort Garland, which was completed in 1858, were there to keep the peace between the Hispanos and the Utes. They were also there to keep an eye on the Hispanos.
One of the reasons that it was easier to settle San Luis was because the Americans had already taken over.
So the valley is an important part of Colorado, but a lot of the settlements and stuff began because of Fort Garland. Without the fort, perhaps nothing would have been here.
One of the most prominent early settlers of San Luis was a man named Dario Gallegos, and Dario established a grocery store, which is still in existence today. It's now known as the R&R Grocery, established in 1857. It's the oldest continual business in Colorado.
R&R Market is a general store. It was established by my great-great-grandfather, Dario Gallegos.
When the Santa Fe Trail opened up, he sent wagon trains to St. Louis to bring back products that were not available easily from Mexico. The big products that he brought were shoes and boots.
The market was a place where people came to socialize. The 20th of the month was a big day in town. Everybody looked forward to coming on that day to meet families and to meet other people and to talk about what was going on in everybody's family. And it was a great time for people.
His family was very well respected because of the way they treated their customers. They gave credit, farm implements and that sort of thing, and pay it off. People were able to get things that they needed.
He died at a very young age. He was wounded on one of those trips coming from St. Louis over the Vega Pass when the Utes, attacked him. He lost 2 of his men, and they would take him 9 months to make the round trip to St. Louis. He was a young man, but a very energetic person, saw the future, understood the future, and left the most successful business in the state when he was gone.
The original settlers were all Catholic.
When the first settlers arrived, they did several things. One was to build some shelter. The next thing that they did was to dig a ditch to channel water from the creek to the fields in order to raise crops. Then the next thing was to build the church.
The oldest church in Colorado is in San Nicasio.
Ute Indians were pushing back hard against the Hispanos in southern Colorado, trying to drive them out of places like the valley. And so the community story goes, all of the men were out working in the fields one day, and they had left behind the women and the children and the elderly in their little adobe placita. And that's when the Ute Indians struck.
And when the people saw that the Native Americans were coming to attack, they gathered and they prayed to the patron saint of soldiers, San Nicasio, Saint Acacius.
As the villagers were on the ground praying, the Ute Indians rode up and then turned around and rode away.
As they were praying, the Native Americans that were going to attack noticed up in the clouds this image of a Roman soldier, and they backed away and did not attack. And because Saint Acacius, San Nicasio, answered their prayers, they established a church in the spot and named it San Nicasio.
And if you go to this little town today, there's still a chapel there. And if you go inside, they still tell the story of San Ysidro and the miracle of San Nicasio.
Religion in the San Luis Valley played a primary role because we were so far away from the church.
People taught their kids to read and write so that they could study the Bible. They established an organization known as the Penitentes because they were so isolated that there were no priests available to conduct the religious rituals and practices.
They built buildings that were utilized for religious ceremonies. They acted in the stead of the priests who were only able to visit the community maybe once every 6 months or once a year to perform baptisms and weddings.
The church itself was part of the community. It was just vital to the community. It provided the structure, many times the social outlets for the community were through the church. And so the church has always been significant.
Faith and religion is such an important part of San Luis. San Luis even sits in a mountain range that is named after the blood of Christ. So the entire landscape is infused with religious significance, with spiritual significance, with the stories of Christianity, with the stories of saints.
Growing up, we were taught that being stewards of the land and family were the things that we had to take care of.
In so many ways, the San Luis Valley is a cultural island. The people who moved into the valley in the 1800s traced their traditions and their cultures back to Spain in the Middle Ages.
The Spanish language of San Luis is unique.
The Spanish that's spoken here is a combination of vocabulary from many different sources.
It has a lot of archaisms, so it's a lot of Spanish that was spoken during the time of Cervantes. So it's easy for us to read Cervantes and understand it because a lot of the words and the nuances are the way we speak and the way we think.
Because we were isolated and because the Spanish settlers did not have constant communication with Spain, they didn't know the new rules that were changing, the new words that were added, or how things might have been changing in the language. And that isolation kept the language intact.
Nowhere else in the world do you have Nahuatl, the Aztec language, or French, or Calo, English, all those things coming together to create this Spanish that we use in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado.
So we have this combination of a language that has 4 or 5 different elements that have been added to it.
I think that preservation of the language is key to preserving culture. The last of culture to disappear is the cuisine.
We tend to share some of the same attributes that northern New Mexico retains in the green and red chili.
Chili and beans, tortillas, buñuelos, which other people call sopapillas, but we call buñuelos. We do a lot of fried potatoes. Obviously, potatoes are big here.
And we wanted to maintain a fresh form of corn for the winter months. And so we put it in the hornos and cooked it. We would then take it off the cob and preserve it. And then we would cook it by itself or with beans, and it would give it a fresh kind of taste of corn.
And because of our history to the land and our connection to the land, we have been able to grow our own food here, even though we have a very short growing season.
The valley is so isolated. It's so far away from centers of government or commerce or any of the cultural centers. And so the settlers in the valley over time really had to rely on their own devices in order to maintain a sense of culture and community.
The SPM-DTU was established on November 21st, 1900.
Which is the Protection for the Society of the United Workers. It's the oldest Hispanic organization in the country.
It is a group of people who got together to fight against the incursion of Anglos into the area.
Family support needed to occur so that people could A, learn the new language, learn the new customs, incorporate those into their own, and as well try to retain their own sense of culture and community, and more importantly, be treated fairly and equitably and justly in regards to the way their land was treated and their families were treated.
The settlers in the valley over time really had to rely on their own devices in order to maintain a sense of culture and community. The SPM-DTU became an extremely cohesive social force in the San Luis Valley that held together these isolated communities and provided a sense of mutual identity and mutual protection. You could come together in this organization as a larger community.
It's important to be able to save some of the remnants of how we lived in the past.
History is experiences. Preservation allows people to go back in time and see how people lived, how they survived using what was at hand. Things like mud to create adobe bricks, to build homes, to build churches.
All our traditions and ways of life were exciting, and I'm interested in seeing what we can do to preserve those ways of life that have been so productive for the Hispano culture here.
Identifying and understanding that history is important for our communities. It gives us a sense of pride in who we are. It connects us to the larger Latino community throughout the United States. And it enables you to see that you in this generation are not the only one that comes to the table with issues and trials and tribulations, but that people behind you, your antepasados, which are your ancestors, also had those same kinds of trials and tribulations. And it is your lineage that creates your ability to move forward, and understanding that helps you be successful.
We are the first ones that were here, short of the American Indian. And so we were here, and we're still here.
People laughing when I say we don't want the Taco Bells and McDonald's here. We want to maintain our culture. We want to maintain the traditions. We want to be good stewards of the land and the water. We want to maintain the family, keep the close family ties. And we will fight to maintain that.
Even though we're isolated, we're still very much a part of mainstream America.
We have a lot of firsts. We have oldest ditch, oldest store, oldest church, and our legacy is that we're preserving that. That is important to us, and that we want that to be recognized and continue in the future.
It's a land and a people that contributes to the rich cultural diversity of a place like Colorado. Colorado wouldn't be Colorado without the San Luis Valley. The Hispanic and Spanish and Chicano heritage that is so much part of our fabric comes from the southern part of Colorado, from the centuries-long story of Hispanic people and American Indians. That story is embedded in the heart of who we are as Coloradans. The more we know about it, the richer our own lives are, and the richer our sense of identity as Coloradans really can be.